The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining the Responsible Initiative webinar on the revised RMAP procedure and assessment tools. Please know that the presentation portion of this training will be recorded and stored on our free e-learning academy. All participants are currently in listen-only mode. Please save all questions until the Q&A portion of the webinar in the end. At that time, if you would like to speak, please raise your hand and we will unmute your line. Or you can also use the questions box on the GoToMeeting pane. We have a lot of information to cover today. It's just 1 hour, so we'll go quite quickly, but please feel free to also circle back with us by email if you have any questions. So we'll take a look at the updates to the procedure, especially some of the critical issues that we've received questions about, including the sampling methodology, further guidance for CAHRAs, point about auditor notes, specifications of finding types, and the new form for the preliminary findings leave behind. We will then move to highlight the report writing expectations, the annotated assessment workbook, and looking at questions that we've received recently from auditors and audit firms. First and foremost, the procedure. It was shared with you in June and became effective on July 15th. Some of the key changes include procedural elements, including assessment process, timeline, scope methodology, sampling, and some of the key elements have been moved from the standard into the procedure. We've also updated the sampling methodology for high-risk sourcing, reducing the sample from 100% to a smaller sample size for transactions over 100. And we've added a specific form that would be easier to print out as opposed to a cap in the Excel for the preliminary findings acknowledgement. So first and foremost, we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the sampling and the transaction selections. So hopefully everybody is clear that auditors shall select 50% of the transactions that occurred within the audit period using the sampling guidance in the procedure, and to provide the list of selected transactions to the company at least 5 business days before the assessment. The company can provide the transactions list in any format chosen by the company as long as it includes the information covered here, including the type of material, the date, the weight, the type of supplier, the number of active suppliers, and whether or not they have low and high risk sourcing. Please note that you're also supposed to be submitting a simple narrative of a sampling plan to RMI staff for review and approval in advance of the assessment. This is really to help make sure that auditors are clear on the updated sampling requirements. This is also a question in the workbook. When you're conducting sampling, the expectation is that you really pick a representative sample and using a risk-based approach. So it's important to look at total number of transactions received, the number of high-risk suppliers and sources identified, the proportion of secondary versus non-secondary material. So this is non-secondary is mine material, right? And secondary could be recycled or scrap. The number of active suppliers, the types of suppliers, so whether or not there are traders versus smelters and refiners, and if they are also conformant or not as part of the RMI program. The number of different countries of origin, and any anomalies observed during the review of the transactions. Now, specifically on the updates to the high-risk sampling approach. So in the past, there was a requirement that 100% of sampling for all high-risk transactions had to be looked at. However, of course, we understand, especially for gold refiners, but sometimes also for tin and tantalum and tungsten and cobalt, there are over 1,000 transactions, if not more. And that's just not feasible to do during the few days that are planned ahead of time for the assessment. So that's why we took the approach of we will still have a 99% confidence interval with 3% margin of error for all transactions of over 100. Obviously, under 100 transactions, not that many transactions, so it's fairly feasible for auditors to review. Please note that if an auditee has a mix of low risk and high risk transactions, you're only to use the high risk transaction sampling for those high risk transactions. Then please follow the simple or complex sampling plan for low risk transactions for the other transactions. So we're really looking at the risk of transactions, not the risk of the assessment or the risk of the auditee here. Specifically for the simple versus complex sampling plan for low risk, we received a question of when is it best to pick one versus the other. Well, this is largely up to the auditor's professional judgment to decide to use a complex sampling plan versus a simple one. When the facility sourcing practices are more complex, even if they're not sourcing from low-risk countries or high-risk suppliers, it would be advisable for the auditor to use a complex sampling plan. For example, if a facility sources large volumes of different material types or has a myriad of different suppliers, or their materials are coming from many different countries, or they source from aggregators, or other reason to use a complex sampling plan. In the cases where the sample was initially selected by the auditor using a simple sampling plan, however, an on-site, during the transactions and other documentation review, if the auditor decides to expand the sample, if there are any irregularities, or if the auditor finds gaps in the evidence reviewed, that's totally acceptable approach as well. So again, you can start with selecting a complex auditing plan, some complex sampling plan just by looking at the initial transactions list, or you can increase the number of samples you're looking at if you're finding gaps or red flags during your review. Another question that we've received, and we also noted through report review and auditee feedback, that CAHRAs determination, so conflict affected and high risk areas, and the development of CAHRAs procedure and implementation of that procedure, as well as auditors' review of the steps that auditees take to address that, have been a big challenge. So we did want to take a step and just remind auditors some critical elements of CAHRAs procedure evaluation. Number one, you have to check for 5 things always. You have to check for criteria, meaning that CAHRAs procedure always has to cover criteria addressing Annex 2 risks. Simplified, it could fall under conflict, human rights, and good governance, and that has to be articulated. Resources, which are different from criteria, are reputable international sources or indices that actually provide information that could help inform auditees' decision in terms of whether or not the country they're sourcing from has a risk of conflict, human rights, or governance issues. Next, there is a threshold determination. So once the auditee picks a resource, for example, an index for conflict, then they have to decide whether it's high risk of conflict or medium risk of conflict or low risk of conflict is their threshold for determining whether or not a certain country is affected by risk of conflict. And they have to articulate that in the procedure. Last but not least, they do have to articulate frequency of review. Some companies review their procedures on an ongoing basis, some do it quarterly, some do it annually. at the minimum, they have to review annually. Next, it's important to look at the completeness of the procedure and check for consistent implementation. It's important to make sure that all of these elements are not only covered in the procedure, but also implemented. If they are not, that would lead to a non-conformance. Obviously, absence of a procedure or absence of any of these elements from the procedure will also lead to a non-conformance. We will talk about the possibility of conformance with continual improvement if there is a partial implementation in place during the findings section. We also wanted to highlight a few different resources on how to identify CAHRAs, as auditors have noted that a lot of times auditees pick different indices or different reports or resources that auditors may or may not be very familiar with. So auditors wanted to get a little bit more details about the different CAHRAs resources. You can find that information by going to RMI's CAHRAs resource page. There's a long list of various different internationally accepted resources to determine CAHRAs. There is also an EU guidelines and CAHRAs resource list that the European Commission has put out. The two last resources that you see here, they are not available publicly. They're only available to RMI members and auditees. However, we did want to highlight it for you, just so you're aware that these resources exist, especially the RMI country risk assessment tool that actually aggregates a number of reputable indices and reports that look at all of these key criteria, conflict, human rights, and good governance, and incorporate Annex 2 risks, and basically produce a global map of what could be potentially constituted as conflict-affected or high-risk countries. And smelters and refiners that participate in RMI programs do have access to this. So if they're not aware, you could mention it to them, or if they tell you that they're using RMI country risk assessment tool or country risk map, you'll know what they're referring to. Another question that we have received was on Auditor Notes and what is the difference between the summary report, the workbook, and the notes. So RMI only needs to receive summary report and the workbook, but auditors do need to maintain professional notes. This is pretty standard for social and management systems audits. So you all should be familiar with this practice. The auditor notes do not have to be lengthy, just capturing important information. And they can be referred to if need be for more information if RMI or auditee come back with questions about the report or on-site activities. I can tell you that we've already had situations where the reports we received may not have included all the information necessary for the audit, and we have then connected back with the auditors asking them if they've captured this information in their auditor notes. So that could be a pretty frequent occurrence. So it's pretty important that anything that's in scope of the assessment that you think is important, especially in terms of transaction review or KYC review that you might be noting and not including in the workbook, that you maintain in your auditor notes. But you do not need to submit it to the RMI. We also wanted to spend a little bit of time on the standard finding types. I will not talk much about conformance or non-conformance. Hopefully that's fairly clear. However, we've received a lot of questions about this finding type for conformance with continual improvement and the difference between that and conformance with observation, and also the section and question in the workbook that asks about auditees' continual improvement activities from the past audit. So going back to the first, continual improvement. It is essential to understand that due diligence is an ongoing, proactive, and reactive process. And therefore, we are allowing, in cases where a required policy, procedure, process, or design have been developed, but only implemented partially, for the auditor to choose to side conform with continual improvement. We do leave it up to the auditor's decision, though, because obviously if we're talking about implementation of 2% out of 100% of a certain procedure or process, it's possible that the auditor would decide that it's still a non-conformance. However, if it's partial implementation, more like 50-50 or 30-70, the auditor could potentially designate a site as conform with continual improvement if the auditee formally acknowledges that not all due diligence has been completed and they're in a process of completing it, and provides a clear plan or roadmap for implementation to the auditor prior to the end of the on-site audit. That's really important. There has to be a plan in place. So for example, if the auditee is implementing a policy and as part of that supply chain policy, they are asking their suppliers to sign on to the policy and to send them all their KYC documents. And because it's their first time undergoing the revised standard and they've only started implementing it 6 months ago, the auditee has 100 suppliers and they've only been able to reach 40. So it's quite normal to understand that they haven't had the chance to gather signed acknowledgements of the policy or of the contracts with their suppliers with the updated requirements from all 100 suppliers. However, the auditee does have to provide you with a clear timeline as to when they expect that to happen. If continual improvement finding is not addressed by the next assessment, auditor may escalate that to a non-conformance. So it's really important that as you're going to facilities that are going through a reassessment or their next assessment for the revised standard, to review not only past non-conformances, but most importantly to review conformances with continual improvement to make sure that those have actually been closed out. Again, I do want to stress that this is different. The continual improvement finding, conformance with continual improvement, is different from a question in the workbook about what continual improvement activities has the auditee done since the last assessment. Especially if it's their first time undergoing a revised RMAP assessment, the auditor may recognize that all the progress that they've made updating their system to move from conformance to the old RMAP standard to the revised RMAP standard and enhancement to the systems that they had to complete, that would be a positive answer to whether or not the facility has conducted any continual improvement activities since the last assessment. If you're conducting a repeat audit of a facility that has already undergone a revised standard assessment, you may also look at conformance with continual improvement findings to see if the facility has closed them out and note them in the section. But this section is broader than just past conformance with continual improvement findings. It's really looks at any activities that the auditee may have conducted to improve their systems. So it could even be going beyond the basic requirements. For example, if the auditee was initially just conducting on-site assessments for their high-risk ASM mines, and over the past audit period, they've actually moved to conduct on-site assessment for all mining facilities, that would go into a continual improvement section of the workbook. Another new development in terms of the procedure is the preliminary finding small acknowledgement leave behind. So this is very similar to a cap that is left at the facilities during a social audit. Specifically for RMAP assessment, what we ask auditor to do is to complete that just with the non-conformance findings. So do not include other findings type in the acknowledgement form, and ask the auditee to sign it, explaining to them that these are just preliminary findings and they may change through the report review process, and that by signing the form, they don't necessarily agree to the findings, they just confirm that those findings have been communicated to them. This document is designed to be an additional form of confirmation to the closing meeting. So it is not in lieu of the closing meeting. The closing meeting still has to happen, and during the closing meeting, you still have to verbally tell the auditee all of the findings, not just the non-conformances, but also conformance with continual improvement and conformance with observation. The difference between continual improvement, we've already discussed. The conformance with observation. Normally, conformance with observation just means that it's pretty much the auditee is conformant, but there is a note that the auditor wants to flag. Or if the auditor initially found a gap of the auditee system, but the auditee was able to close that gap during the time that the auditor was still on site, instead of putting them as non-conformant or purely conformant, the auditor can use conform with observation to note that. And all of those different types of findings do have to be communicated verbally during the closing meeting. However, for the preliminary findings leave behind, that can be done, again, it's just for the non-conformances. The preliminary findings leave behind can be printed out for to be signed by hand, or it can actually also be signed electronically for ease of use. Now I'm going to pause here and give it over to Catherine to talk about RMAP report writing expectations.
Hello, everyone. For those of you who have not met me already, I am the new RMAP program manager. And as Mariana mentioned, I'm going to just share a brief reminder about report writing expectations and QA, QC. Just a brief reminder that the report package, which is the workbook and the assessment summary report, is imperative in order to demonstrate that the auditor has used the appropriate methodology and has followed the RMAP procedure when conducting an RMAP assessment. While you may not be used to providing such detail, we recognize that it is a change from the previous workbook. The report and the workbook are the measures of quality of the on-site assessment that RMI, our members, and auditees have. And here's a list of just a few reminders that one, a report writing day is included in all RMAP bids in order to ensure timely delivery of the assessment workbook and report within 7 business days of the completed on-site assessment. And this timeline does include the audit firm's internal QC review. As noted here, it is expected that audit firms are scheduling a reporting day for the auditor immediately after the on-site assessment in order for this timeline to be met. We do also want to remind everyone that workbooks and reports for Chinese smelters and refiners should include translation into Chinese, just to make sure that you move forward doing that if you haven't been doing so already. Additionally, timelines for report writing and QC, as stated in the procedure, are still expected even if the auditor is in the field or otherwise offline after completion of the assessment. Internal QC should catch mistakes, particularly simple ones like grammar and spelling errors, before they are sent to before the reports and workbooks are sent to the RMI for review. And finally, we do want to reiterate that auditors should be reviewing the RMI reviewer feedback and responding to each point in every round of QC. We certainly do not want to be seeing the same points that have come up in previous rounds of QC being unaddressed in subsequent rounds. And I'll hand it back to Mariana just to speak a bit about triangulation and corroboration.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And just also a note to everybody that the reports that have gone through the 3 rounds of QC and have still not been addressed will be escalated to an independent review committee and potentially may lead to, especially if that's a multiple occurrence, to potential either auditor or firm suspension. So it is really critical. There are 3 opportunities for review here. So if there are questions or you have clarifications about the reviewer comments to your report, please let us know. We'd rather get these questions as opposed to receiving back reports with the reviewer comments that have not been addressed. So another reminder here in terms of completion of the workbook is just a stress on the data points requirements. So every question in the workbook is expected to have triangulation or at the very least corroboration of 2 or more data points. Auditors must list the types of evidence referenced, and you'll see in the annotated workbook, now every single question actually includes guidance of what types of evidence you can be reviewing. Please note that if the annotated workbook provides you with examples of 5 different data points, it is not for you to choose one of those 5 data points to fill out. It is expected that you're able to corroborate those 5 evidence points unless the auditee doesn't have something in place, and that's understandable. So as an example, a lot of times we receive responses to workbook questions that the evidence is management systems interview. That is not a sufficient evidence point on its own, and it must be corroborated through either documentation review, employee interviews, on-site observations, or all of the above. Another question we receive sometimes about whether or not, how to assess whether or not management has actually appropriate background for their job and their position. And again, management interview with that specific manager is generally not sufficient to address that question. You can be looking at their CVs, you can be interviewing other employees to corroborate that evidence. Just the manager itself telling you that they have sufficient background to do the job is not sufficient, just as an example. Now I'll turn it back over to Catherine to talk about the changes to the annotated assessment workbook.
Thank you, Mariana. So as you can see here, and as I'm sure you're all familiar with at this point, we have adopted a new annotated assessment workbook. This workbook is effective for all reporting as of July 18th, and please note that the latest version date is July 28th. We'll show you a little later how to make sure that you're working with the latest version. It is documented in the workbook. So based on auditor feedback, RMI did simplify and streamline the RMAP reporting process. And the key change here being that we moved all of the content from the narrative report in Word over to the Excel workbook, apart from the summary report. And we did release further auditor completion guidance throughout the workbook to clearly outline RMI's expectations of completion throughout. Particularly on the as we'll see as we go through the screenshots, the auditor completion guidance does specify expectations of auditors' review and verification of information that is added to the overview tab by the auditee, and then data points, and also shares the expectations that we have around the data points that need to be examined and the details that that need to be added to support auditor conclusions in the management systems, high-risk questions, and auditor conclusion tabs. We do also want to highlight that the auditor conclusion dropdown does have additional options here. They are conform with observations, conform with continual improvement, non-conform, and not able to assess. And Mariana did just go over those, so we'll move on now to looking at the actual screenshots to highlight some of the major changes that have happened to each of the tabs. So moving on to examining the overview tab. Again, I do want to at least show you that the auditor completion guidance has been added into column F. And as mentioned before, it does highlight the expectations that we have for verifying the information. Additionally, there are some new fields that have been added, including the smelter CID, as well as the audit firm and auditors. Additionally, on the next slide, we can see that we've also added the requirement for the identification of RMAP or equivalent smelters, as well as the source of recycled material. And moving on to the last slide we have here just demonstrates where you can find the document control, and you can check the revision date there to make sure that you're using the most recent version of the annotated workbook. So certainly encourage you just to go back in any workbooks that you currently have for ongoing assessments, just to verify that you are using the version with the date that is specified there. Moving on to the Management Systems tab, do want to highlight that the instructions here have been updated to specify that auditors must use data points to triangulate evidence of conformance, as Mariana did go into more detail about previously. And those data points that we do need for that evidence triangulation are listed in the auditor completion guidance column. And if you can't see it from zooming in 100% in the assessment workbook, please be sure just to scroll over because we promise that it is there. Moving on to the next slide here, just want to highlight a couple of new questions that have been added. One is the question for, are the questions around cash transactions? Does the company aim to avoid cash transactions where possible? And when cash transactions are unavoidable, are they supported by verifiable evidence? For gold specifically, the standard was amended to specify that additional due diligence must be carried out in alignment with the Financial Action Task Force requirements for transactions of over 15,000 USD in cash. And then finally, we also added, there was a question added here, number 6, where appropriate, does the company support the implementation of the principles and criteria of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative? Moving forward into the high-risk sourcing questions tab, again, I do want to point out the auditor completion guidance that was added in column F, as well as pointing out that the evidence column has been removed. And I do want to clarify that if the smelter is sourcing all high-risk supply chains from an approved upstream assurance mechanism, you do not need to answer lines 6 through 67. For example, if it's only high-risk supply chain and the source is DRC and the smelter and the auditee uses ITSE, that's fine, and you don't need to complete those questions on that tab. Moving on to slide 25, do want to highlight the new tab, sampled selections. This was the line item summary in the old standard, and it does provide quite a bit of detail that we do need everyone to get into in providing information for the sample transactions that are reviewed during the assessment.
And I can jump. Yeah. Perfect. Yes. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I can jump in here and just talk a little bit more about really the level of detail that's expected. We received a few questions about this. So please do provide brief descriptions in this section, including names of documents reviewed and any gaps identified. So while for some columns, yes or no answer might be acceptable, most columns do require more information. For example, if KYC review was not completed, no is acceptable. However, if it was only partially completed, let's say up to supplying smelter that is not on the RMI conformant list, in that case, please do provide details of up to which point KYC was completed. Don't just put yes or partial without explanation. Or, for example, under plausibility, don't just put yes. Explain what resource did auditee reference in their plausibility check, as it might be different depending on the different origin source. Also, please do not put yes under context. That just makes no sense. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Mariana. And then another new tab that I want to highlight here is the Auditor Conclusions tab. The purpose of this tab is to highlight the overall conclusions that the auditor has reached during the course of the assessment. A lot of the underlying questions that were previously on the Management Systems tab and previously in the more content-heavy report have been moved here. Particularly information about the company context, the sampling methodology, details on the opening and closing meetings, etc., are now located here. And we certainly do encourage you to review that pretty closely and make sure that you're providing the level of detail and meeting the expectations that is specified in the auditor completion guidance, again pointed out there for everyone to review. Additionally, want to point out a couple of where these content sections that moved from the narrative report in Word to Excel did wind up in this spreadsheet. So as you can see, as I mentioned before, the sampling methodology applied, the company context, the opening meeting, and then on the next slide you can see opportunities for continual improvement have wound up here. And I will actually hand it over to Mariana, and she can dive a little bit more into the details around continual improvement.
Thanks, Catherine. As noted earlier, this specific continual improvement section and the question in the workbook is backward looking, asking about auditee improvement actions from the last assessment. For example, if the last assessment was against the old RMAP standard, the actions company took to get their management systems ready for the assessment against the revised RMAP can be listed here. This is different from the finding type of conform with continual improvement. If the auditee did have conform with continual improvement finding type in the previous assessment, auditor should make a note here of how it was addressed. However, auditor can also list additional steps that the auditee has taken to improve their systems that go beyond past findings. For example, if the company recently decided to conduct on-site assessments, not just with the company-owned staff, but by independent third party. We also wanted to highlight the CAP tab. It is currently unchanged. However, there are a couple of changes coming. Furthermore, we also wanted to provide a few reminders about how to complete the current CAP tab as well. So first and foremost, please do fill in both non-conformances, but also other finding types here in the first part of the CAP tab. In the past, during the old assessment standard, it was filled in by RMI, and we've also had that for a number of time while we had the lengthy summary report narrative. That's where you would put your non-conformance and other types of findings. However, since we've cut the narrative report down and we took out the nonconformances, it's important then that you fill out this part of the CAP tab and you put all types of findings that you've had for the assessment. It's currently still noted as to be completed by the program, but we are clarifying the language shortly, and we will be moving to say that it will be to be completed by the auditor and then verified by the audit program. And here we'll also clarify that it's description of all types of findings, not just the nonconformances. Please also remember to fill in the suggested improvement measures section as well. For the CAP review, auditors do need to fill in the date of the CAP review on the CAP tab pointed out here. And also, it's important for the CAP review to focus on nonconformances. But if any continual improvement opportunities that would be also listed here as a finding, if they have been addressed, please highlight that as well. If not, that will be okay, since the auditor at the next assessment will be reviewing whether or not the conformance with continual improvement have been closed by then. All determinations from CAP also need to utilize multiple data sources and verify both policy procedure development and implementation. So you need to articulate what did you as an auditor review and how did the auditor come to a specific conclusion? What changes did the audit team make to its operations and how it was implemented? RMI is asking to summarize and explain how you verified that, in fact, the auditee has changed their practices. And as we've already mentioned during the next audit, the review of the completion of continual improvement opportunities has to be conducted. And they may be raised to the level of nonconformances if not addressed by then. I'll pass it back to Catherine to talk about the revised summary report.
Thanks, Mariana. Briefly, just want to go over and reiterate that there's still, although the bulk of the narrative, as we've explained, has moved into the annotated assessment workbook, there is still a requirement to provide a revised summary report. And that is just the 3-page summary report that will show you screenshots of, just to be clear that of the level of information that we're asking for here. These do need to be provided, whether it is you're providing a report for an on-site assessment or providing a CAP review, particularly if the determination ultimately changes. We do need those revised summary reports on hand internally. And I do want to reiterate that we do want, between the workbook, but particularly in the revised summary report as well, please be sure to verify that the information contained here is specific to the auditee that is the subject of the report. Please be wary of copying and pasting from other reports so that we don't accidentally have contact information from the previous auditee for whom you were writing a report winding up in a later report that they are not the subject of. And then I do want to just move on and show you the screenshot of what this summary report looks like. By now, many, if not all of you, should have seen or worked with the template that we have for this. It really is very simple, just all of the summary information, a total of 4 sections, and ending at the conclusion portion here. The very last slide here just shows that it does also include the very end of that conclusion section. But just reiterating that that is still a requirement, even though the bulk of the narrative is now in the annotated assessment workbook. And for the next section, I'll hand it back to you, Mariana.
Thanks so much, Catherine. We are about ready to open this up to the Q&A. However, first, we did want to highlight a few questions that we have received to share with everybody. Number 1, when can I find the most up-to-date RMAP documents? Hopefully your program managers have shared with you and continue to share with you new versions, but if you're not 100% sure, you are also welcome to visit RMI website under the Smelter Introduction. All of the RMAP audit documents are available there. Again, make sure to check for document version and revision date to make sure you have the latest document. Question about where can I find required training and other auditor requirements. That's also available on the RMI website under our auditor page. We very clearly list the number of trainings that we expect auditors to complete, and we add to that list on an ongoing basis. We have just added 2 more animated short trainings on OECD 5-step due diligence as well as on Cobalt. So we do encourage you to review both the auditor page and then also the e-learning platform to view the training. Is RMAP assessment procedure fully applicable to Cobalt? Yes, the procedure covers all minerals under the RMAP program, including Cobalt, including 3Ts, including the downstream programs. Where there are differences present between 3Ts, gold, and cobalt, they are flagged in the procedure. So, for example, the next question talks about mass balance calculation. So mass balance or material reconciliation is required for all materials, including gold. However, specifically, the mass balance formula is only required for 3Ts because gold is actually, it really makes no sense to have the 10% margin of error. For gold, really, if you're losing any more than 1%, you should be out of business. So using a mass balance calculation really is worthwhile for larger quantities of cheaper materials, not for gold. Nonetheless, you still have to do material reconciliation, making sure that the volumes that are going in to the refiner or the smelter plant are equal to those coming out, obviously accounting for the purification process and the differences in weight based on that. Now, for the risk-based audit program and a 3-year audit cycle, we did receive a few questions about that. So for companies on the 3-year cycle, the auditor should focus on the previous 12 months. However, they can reach back further if they feel there is a reason to do so. That's really important. If the auditee is telling you that, no, it's just the past 12 months, that is not correct. If there is a reason for you to look past 12 months into the past 24 months, for example, let's say you're doing a transaction review or KYC review and there are a lot of gaps. As an auditor, you are completely in your right to do so. Couple more questions that are not listed here, but we wanted to flag to you as well, including the EITI question. This is one of the 2 new questions that Catherine has highlighted since we've received a request for clarification there. So unless the smelter is involved in extractive activities, they are not required to report under EITI. Their policy should focus on suppliers and the mine side responsibilities to report and support EITI implementation. So it's encouraging their suppliers, specifically mine sites, to implement EITI, not necessarily smelters or refiners themselves implementing EITI. So as an auditor, what you would do is ask the smelter, how do they support the EITI principles? Have they reviewed the principles? Have they evaluated their responsibilities? Have they looked at their suppliers' responsibilities? Have they embedded commitment and support into their policies? Have they communicated expectations to suppliers? If they have not done any of these, you can cite that as a non-conform. If they are at least aware of the EITI principles, For the first year of implementation, our recommendation would be, where applicable, to cite it as an opportunity for continual improvement. And if the smelter refiner is actually sourcing from countries that are non-implementing countries for EITI, and there are some, then you could select not applicable. So let me pause here. We have a few minutes left before we close the call and see if there are any questions about the material that we've covered here, or any other questions related to the procedure or the workbook. Just as a reminder, please feel free to either type your question here in a chat box or just click on the little hand button and we will unmute your line. You're also definitely welcome to send us an email with any of the questions that you might have. While we're waiting for questions, perhaps I'll share one more question that we've received. And this is a question on sampling. So sampling of high risk versus low risk, obviously the number of samples vary dramatically. So the question was, if initially the auditee actually erroneously identifies themselves as only sourcing low risk, but then when you get to the facility, you realize that the facility is actually in fact sourcing either all high risk or partially high risk transactions. So since you have to select 50% of the sample before on-site visit, and obviously also most of the time the assessment days have already been preset, really what is the way to approach the sample selection on-site? So a couple of points here. It is possible that especially during the first audit for a facility conducted under the revised RMAP standard, this facility misidentified its high-risk transaction as low risk, leading to the auditor or RMI planning for less days on site and utilizing a low-risk sampling plan. In such cases, the misidentification of risk is largely due to either absence of CAHRA procedure, improper CAHRA procedure, lack of or inconsistency in implementation of the procedure, all of which would result in a non-conformance. In such cases, auditor would do the best that they can to increase the sample of transactions review, but RMI understands that there might not be enough time to review all files. Either way, the facility in this case would be a non-conformant and going into CAP. On rare occasions where appropriate CAHRA policy is actually in place and the facility is able to demonstrate implementation for the most part, however, there is a small number of transactions that have been misidentified as low risk, which are supposed to be high risk, the auditor only has to expand the sample for that small group of transactions to the high risk sampling plan. And that should be feasible to do in the initially planned for time on site. In the future, of course, after the first round of audits under the revised standard is complete, it should be a lot easier to estimate person days on site. We do understand that currently there are some challenges to the estimation, especially as facilities are grappling for the first time with their understanding of what constitutes high risk, how to design and implement CAHRA's procedure. In cases where you are informed by the auditee ahead of the audit about the change in low risk, high risk designations, if the number of high risk transactions is so high you believe the audit would take longer than initially planned, please do inform RMI immediately and we will try to facilitate extending days on site. If it's too short notice to change the travel arrangement or extend the time on site, please still inform RMI immediately that this would result in a potential limitation that may or may not impact conformance determination during the audit. This will be then decided on case-by-case basis depending on how much transaction documentation the auditor was able to review and what was the quality of the documentation. So please keep a direct and ongoing communication with RMI so we can come up with an agreeable approach. So hopefully these questions help address some of the things that you've been wondering too as well, because we've received repetitive questions from the auditors. I do see that we have a few questions here. So let's see if we can address a few of them. So one question is, will the CAP tab in Annotated Workbook contain auditor completion guidance for closing the CAP? Yes, since we will be updating the CAP to specify a few of the things that I mentioned already, we will include the guidance there. But the guidance is also very clearly stated in the procedure, and it is the expectation that both the program managers, the auditors, and the reviewers are very familiar with the procedure. So there's a question about, would it be a nonconformance if the country where the auditing isn't part of the EITI? No, it will just be an NA. Again, it's not up to smelters or refiners to affect which countries are implementing countries of EITI and which are not. And so if they are based in a non-implementing country, or if they're sourcing from a non-implementing country, that would be an NA. Can we send the auditee the sample page from the annotated workbook to ask to complete? Because if the auditee, sorry, I just lost the question here. There we go. Because if the auditee does not have a format to submit transaction lists, they're sending lists that don't contain all the necessary content. Great question. So as I've stated in the beginning of the webinar, there are specific types of information that are required for submission. So if that information is not present, you can do one of two things. You can just go back to the auditee and say that you're missing this and this information, or you can also send them a sample LIS. There is actually a sample LIS that's available on the RMI website. It's updated. It's similar from what an old line item summary used to look like, and the auditee can complete that. Specifically, the sampled section in the workbook, though, is designed for the auditor to complete, because it's not what the auditee tells you they have, it's what you as the auditor have reviewed. So there is a difference. But like I said, if the auditee is struggling with providing that information, maybe they don't have a format that they can use that includes all the key information, you can send them, or you can ask us to send them a sample LIS that they can fill out. So I think we did address the first question in terms of narrative for the transactions. We provided a few. There was a question about narrative for transactions. We did provide already a few examples, but please do feel free to email us separately if you have a question about a specific column in the sample tab, because there are quite a few columns, so we obviously don't have time to go over every single column on the call. But as we've already stated, we do expect document names, the type of document you've reviewed. We expect explanations. Let's say if something is only partially available, please know that that's partially available. Some sections, as I've mentioned, yes, they are clear yes or no sections. So you can do that. But if you have a question about a specific column in that sample tab, please do send us an email. There's also a question about Chinese translations. So the workbook and reports for Chinese SORs should include translations into Chinese. Is this upon request or all reports for China moving forward? So it is for all reports. In terms of billing for translation, yes, you will include billing for translation in that report. Obviously, that is extra work from the auditor. Let's see if there are any more questions here. Just bear with me a moment. There's a question about should we disregard revised assessment workbook that is not annotated? Does auditee receive the annotated workbook from RMI to complete in preparation of the audit? So for question number one, yes, please do disregard the revised assessment workbook that is not annotated. It is no longer in use. The date of that workbook is also way before the current June 28th version of the working document. So please make sure that you discard all versions of the workbook, annotated and not annotated, that we used before June 28th. Moving forward, we are no longer using the blank workbook. We are only using annotated workbook, and that's the workbook that goes to the auditee filled in with a report. In terms of the second question of does the auditor receive annotated workbook from RMI to complete in preparation of the audit? No. While the auditee does receive the workbook and can complete the overview tab, generally the management systems tab and high risk tab questions are for auditors to complete. However, some auditees do utilize the annotated workbook as a way to prepare for the assessment to make sure that they actually have all the evidence ready for the questions that the auditors will ask on site. However, we do not require auditees to actually fill in the workbook, just the auditors. Another question is for Cobalt, should we use the same annotated workbook? No, Cobalt does have a separate workbook. So that is available actually on the RMI Cobalt site. So Cobalt page. So if you don't know how to find that, please do send us an email and we'll be happy to share that. So we are at the top of the hour. So I do want to thank everybody for all the questions that you've submitted. If we didn't address any of your questions, please do feel free to loop back with us by email and we'll help provide further clarifications. Thank you again for your time.